Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Project with your host Mick Spears. We bring you thought-provoking guests and topics every week to challenge your thinking about leadership. Our aim is to help you become the leader that you wish you always had as we learn together and lead together. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Project. I'm greatly honoured today to be joined by Oscar Trimboli. Oscar is an author, a listener, and a speaker, and he's the author of a book called How to Listen: Discover the Hidden Key to Better Communication. He's also the host of an Apple Award-winning podcast, Deep Listening. So you can imagine already what today's subject is going to be about. And I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time since we booked Oscar on the show, and to give him a good listening to practice my own listening skills, because I know that I'm going to learn a lot today, and you will as well. So without any further ado, Oscar, please do say hello to our audience. Give us a flavour of your background and what led you to be so passionate about listening and listening skills.
Yeah, g'day, Mick. I'm really looking forward to listening to all of your questions today. And to understand how I came about this, you have to zoom into a board meeting. The board meeting was in April of 2008, and it's a video conference between Sydney, Seattle, and Singapore. The local subsidiary for Microsoft Australia is setting its budget, with the regional office in Singapore and the global head office in Seattle. And these meetings are renowned, Mick, for going over time. I don't know if you've ever sat in one of those meetings. And we were scheduled to go for 90 minutes. And at the 20-minute mark, my vice president in the room, Tracy, looked me straight in the eye and said, "Oscar, I need to see you immediately after the meeting." Now, Mick, I don't know about you, but if somebody says that to you, it's not good. It's kind of like when your significant other says, "Honey, we need to talk." Now, what's ironic is for the rest of the meeting, I paid no attention to what's going on because of the budget I got set. And the meeting finished early. It actually finished at the 70-minute mark. And as everybody was filing out of the room, Tracy reminded me that she needed to talk to me. And as I went to close the door, because she asked to speak to me in private, she said, "You have no idea what you did at the 20-minute mark, do you?" And as I walked back towards her, Mick, the only thing that's going through my mind is I'm going to get fired. I've figured out I've got 13 weeks of salary in the bank, and I don't know what I did to get fired. So as I sit down in front of Tracy, she says, "If you could code how you listen, Oscar, you could change the world." And as profound a moment of listening as that was on Tracy's part, Mick, the only thing going through my head was, I haven't been fired. I can put all that money back in my bank account. And 2008 was the moment that somebody listened to me, listened to the way I listened, but put a mirror up to me and said, "This is quite different. It's quite worth pursuing." So since 2008, I've been on this quest to code how to listen. And the funny thing is, when Tracy said, "If you could code the way you're listening," I've already explained what was going on in my head. Woohoo, I haven't been fired. What I blurted out was, "Tracy, do you mean code or code?" And she goes, "We work at Microsoft, Oscar. I mean code." So Mick, that's where it's all started.
I love this story, Oscar, and the very embodiment of some of the things that I've picked up in your book. And I just want to play that back to you and see if I'm picking out the right thing here. So you, as now, I'm going to say a master of listening, right? So you've really gone deep into the research about what it takes to be a good listener, about the challenges that many people have around listening and what holds them back. And here you are in a meeting where your boss is waiting to give you a compliment, but your mind is distracted. So what I want to know is, were you really listening for the rest of that 70-minute meeting after the 20-minute mark? Yeah. Tell us more.
No, absolutely not. I was writing down on the piece of paper, what are the big expenses in the next couple of months? What's in my bank account? What might I get paid out in terms of holiday owing or something like that? And the reason, Mick, I know I wasn't listening to anything that was going on. My budget line, which was the biggest product line that Microsoft held, just short of $1 billion US. And it typically would be set in the vicinity of low teens, 13, 14, 15% growth. But some of my budget lines that I left that meeting with, I had 32, 38 and 31% growth, not across the whole portfolio. So I knew I wasn't listening, because if I truly was, I would have spoken up. And for many of us, when we are communicating as the leaders, what we say and what the other person hears is completely different because it goes through a listening filter. It goes through a filter of biases. It goes through a filter of judgments. It goes through a filter of any number of things that are getting in the way. It would be great if we all walked around with closed captioning in front of us, so that would signal what we're thinking, because I'm sure we'd all adjust the way we speak and listen as a result. Because although Tracy's about to pay me a compliment and the dynamic of this meeting's finishing really quickly, I'm somewhere else altogether.
Yeah, there's two really key things I'm picking up there. One, from the Tracy side of things around conversational intelligence. As leaders, to be careful with the language we use, because people will start jumping to conclusions. And then on the listening side, Oscar, if I can be bold enough to say, you had made an assumption about what Tracy wanted to tell you, and then that impacted you immediately in terms of your mindset about what you were listening or not listening to, where your mind was, regardless of what was happening around you. You were now in your world working on an assumption of what you thought Tracy was going to tell you at the end of the meeting. What did you learn about yourself through that, and how did your world change at that moment?
I'll be honest, I didn't learn anything until 2 weeks later. What I learned 2 weeks later was when Brian, the CFO of the Australian operation, said, Oscar, we're setting the budget for Australia. So we're distributing all the budget out to all the industry segments, or all the business units, all the geographies. I'd like you to come and audit my listening in the budget setting meeting. I said, oh, geez, Brian, you've been talking to Tracy about this listening caper. You know, I got 32, 31, 38% increase in my budget lines. I ain't got time for this listening caper. I've got to figure out how to deliver this budget. You know, our fiscal year is going to kick off in a little under 60 days. And he said those magic words to a budget holder that it's like the icing on the cake. It's like the sugar in your tea. It's like, Oscar, I can't help you with your top line. Your budget's set, but we can invest for growth in a discretionary way. So if you come and help me audit my listening, maybe we'll adjust some investments to support your growth areas. Like, Brian, where would you like me to be and when again? Sorry. And it's like, so I sat in this meeting with Brian, and there was roughly 20 people. 10 were on video conference, 10 were in the room. And I was in an observer role. I had the budgets for products were set, so they were now getting distributed out to the business units. And I started, he asks really long questions. Wow, he's only hearing from a handful of people. Oh, people are interrupting, people are cutting off. And that's a pretty closed question in a very open context. And then I realized, as I looked down at what I was scratching out on a spreadsheet, was I'm coding how to listen. And whether I realized it or not, I was now on this very conscious path, and along with the Deep Listening Ambassador community, which is a group of like-minded workplace professionals, we're now on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the workplace. And we've coded it so far into 3 books, into the online listening quiz, into our jigsaw game, into our card games, into the podcast series, and to various online workshops and keynotes as well. And the thing I learned was, I'm a slow learner. What I learned was, even with the cards that we built, that was a story about listening to clients. So I was in this workshop with the clients. We're putting sticky notes up on around a particular topic area they were working on, and they're listening. And at the lunch afternoon tea break, Alice came into the room as I was taking photos, and I was slightly adjusting each little sticky note so that it would all fit into a slide after the fact. And she goes, Oscar, don't touch my card. And I thought, wow, it's a sticky note with some black marker ink on it. And she's put so much meaning into this card. And she's called it a card, but it's a sticky note. Anyway, I was talking to my editor while I was writing the first book, actually. And I said, hey, Kel, this is what happened. And she said, oh, Oscar, why don't you listen? Go and make some cards. And then from that, we created the card set, but we prototyped the cards in a number of workshops and things like that. So the challenge for me as the listening guy, I have to be listening. I just can't do listening. So the book that you just referenced, we spent the better part of a year and a half in research before we wrote a single word. We spoke to people who knew us and what the listening was about. And we spoke to people who had no idea what we were doing in listening and asked them what they were struggling with, because that was another listening technique technique, we thought it was important to role model into what we're doing. And I think as leaders, are you doing the role? Are you being the role? Are you talking about transparency, but not being transparent yourself? Are you talking about authenticity and not showing up authentically yourself? Are you talking about integrity and not being in integrity with yourself? I think there's a really important difference between doing something and being it.
There's three really powerful things that I'm picking up there, Oscar. I'd love to play it back to you. The first one is that, using some words of a previous guest, Stephen Shedleski, that it's hard to see the label on the jar from inside the jar. So sometimes we need someone from outside to recognize our own gift, our own superpower. And this is what's happened with you with Tracy. This is what's happened with you with your CFO. This is what's happened with you with the person that was talking about Alice and Alice's card, to go, hey, there's a message here screaming at you, Oscar. Are you paying attention? So sometimes you need someone from the outside. And I think there's a lesson there. The second thing I'll say, we might come back to that at the end of today's podcast when we talk about call to action and about what leaders can do, is maybe we do need an external voice. Someone looks from the outside that sees things that we do not see. And then the third thing that I'm picking up there, Oscar, is about the power of paying attention. So it's not just about listening to words. It's not about listening to the situation. It's about putting everything together, all of the context, listening to what's being said, what's not being said. A lot of these things are in your book, but it's about being immersed and being able to pay attention. How do those things sit with you?
Well, we talk about the difference between hearing and listening is action. So if you think about those three stories, the Tracy story, the Brian story, the Kelly story, all those stories, I could have heard it and done nothing with it. Yet I heard it and I did something with it. And listening happens before, during, and after a conversation. Everybody focuses on listening during a conversation. And people say to me, hey, well, how do you listen after the conversation? If you've ever been in a meeting and somebody's taken an action and they come back to the next meeting and they go, oh, yeah, good point. Sorry, Mick, I forgot that. Or, oh, I thought you meant this. I did this. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Will come. So for me, the first thing is listening's the willingness to have your mind changed. It doesn't mean listening changes your mind. Are you open enough in any conversation just to be opening your peripheral hearing a little wider, another 45 degrees to invite more possibilities? If you move from hearing to listening, and this happens in individual conversations, in group conversation, but if you're a leader who does any kind of employee engagement studies, any kind of customer satisfaction surveys, stop doing them. What were the actions you were meant to do from the last survey? Implement those before you do the next one. You'll never have a problem people filling in surveys again because they know you're going to do something with it. So listening and being listening means that you will take action. But I want to come back to the question you posed about attention, because I think there's two kinds of attention. We can give attention and we can pay attention. And sometimes you need to show up with different kinds of attention. You can't give attention all the time. You can't pay attention all the time. Paying attention feels like an obligation. It feels like taxation. It feels like something you have to do. I'm paying attention. It's my duty. Whereas giving attention is an act of generosity. It's an act of curiosity. It's coming from a completely different place. And if you know the difference between these two types of attention, you'll bring those two types of attention very differently to a discussion. Sometimes you need to bring the giving attention to a dynamic situation, a fluid situation, a situation of conflict, a situation you don't quite fully understand. That's when you might give attention. Typically, you give attention at the beginning of a project or the beginning of a relationship. Paying attention is something that's quite linear, it's quite sequential. It's typically when the domain is known, it's got a predictable outcome, it's got a predictable set of players, and it will play out in a way that's relatively incremental. So you have to choose which kind of attention you need to bring to the conversation. Yet most of us are stuck in our phones, stuck in our tablets, stuck in our laptops, and we haven't even closed down all the browser tabs in our own mind, let alone the browser tabs on our devices, so that you can even notice if you're giving or paying attention to the person you're having that one-on-one with, that development conversation with, that corrective conversation, that business context setting. That's why it's critical to know and understand that. Are you ready to listen? Because you can't pay attention, you can't give attention to somebody else if your head's full of a whole bunch of browser tabs that are literally flooding your memory.
So there's probably four things actually there, Oscar, I'd like to play back to you in terms of what I'm taking away from that. And the first thing I want to say is that both customers and employees, like your team members, they're all looking for the same things. They want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to feel like they matter. And by using your word, giving attention, it's a gift. You're gifting them your attention, and they'll feel like they are being seen, they are being heard, and they'll feel like you do matter to them. So giving attention, not paying attention. This is really powerful. And then from here, the third thing, the gradation is moving towards this concept of open will. And this is Otto Scharmer calls it in Theory U, that his ultimate level of generative listening is to have an open will where you are willing to allow your mind to be changed. And that is the ultimate gift, because imagine having a conversation. I'm going to pick on active listening here, which is an important skill, by the way. Having a conversation where, yes, the person's going through all the motions. They are hearing what you're saying, but are they truly deeply listening to what you're trying to say? And if you're able to see in their reactions that you've shifted in some way their thinking, that shows that they had the open will. Not that they just heard the words, but they truly cared about what you were saying, and they were willing to let go of preconceived ideas that they might have had before the conversation to hold space for you to bring new information that might shift their attention or shift their thinking left or right a little bit. How does that sit with you, Oscar?
What we know from our research, we've researched nearly 2,500 people specifically on this topic, and 26,000 people who've taken the listening quiz and answered the question, what do you struggle with when it comes to your listening? What they all say is good listeners hear what's said, and great listeners change the way the speaker communicates their idea. This is a very different type of listening from active listening. Active listening, listen to what they say. If you bring a presence to the dialogue that our Indigenous leaders bring in Australia, our Polynesian cousins, our Māori and our Polynesian leaders bring through their presence in a dialogue where typically they're sitting with silence at the beginning of a meeting, a yarning circle, a gathering of elders. This is true in China, in Japan, in Korea, in high context cultures that value the relationship as much as they value the transaction. That presence is a gift that they bring to the conversation. And what it does, ironically and commercially, is when you bring this quality of listening to a conversation, meetings are shorter. And the meetings you have, there are fewer of them because you're not doing the rework because you didn't listen in the last meeting. A great listener can change the way the speaker not only says what they think, but also says what they mean. And often just creating that space, that place of attention, will require, it's minuscule, an extra 30 to 45 seconds of presence and silence. All of a sudden, the speaker will say, actually, Mick, can I level with you? What I'm really struggling with right now is blah, 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 blah. Mick, now I have time to think about it. Our business unit over here, we've got to have the conversation that matters now about some really big changes. What's really important to me in this conversation is there's a whole bunch of really interesting code words like actually, importantly, that you will hear when people start to shift the way they communicate their idea. And when listening takes place in this form, leaders get much more discretionary effort from their teams than they do if they're transactionally listening as well.
So the things I'm hearing here is about the importance of presence and to making sure that the other person feels that you're truly there, to avoid distractions. And you talk a lot about distractions in your book, but then building from there is holding space, including the use of silence, to allow that person to express themselves. And then you'll notice in the choice of words, the conversational intelligence of picking up the signals of, okay, now we're getting to substance. Now we're getting to what's really on their mind. And one of the things in my experience, Oscar, I'll share this with you, in coaching, and you're a certified coach as well, is that often in that first exchange with someone in a coaching session, the first thing they'll say will be somewhat important, but it's going to be the last thing they say is going to be what's really on their mind. And what they're doing is they're building up the courage. They're building up trust. They're testing whether you're listening to them without judgment so that they can tell you what's really on their mind. And if we interrupt them, one of your four villains that we'll talk about in a moment, if you interrupt them, you miss the golden moment. How does that sit with you, Oscar? Tell us your experience there.
I'm going to do a quick commercial break because I notice you're doing a lot of playback.
Yep, that's what I do. That's the show.
I get it. What I'm curious about is thinking about your questions right now. Do you think there's a different question someone in the audience would be absolutely knocking on the door if they were listening to us together right now?
It's a good question. I certainly know that this is what people appreciate in my show, my ability to filter substance from content and to be able to pick up the key messages and then build to the next learning point. So that's the strength of the show, and that's what we get complimented on all the time.
And if someone was knocking on the door right now, do you think there's a question they'd be asking us?
Yes, I think they will want to get to the how do I do it? How do I move past and I hinted towards the 4 villains, which is where I'm going next, but how do I get past my current listening skills towards something that they can practically put in place in the workplace?
Well, I'm going to answer that question, but I do want to just stay with why do you think I asked that question?
Well, it's important that we are thinking about who our audience is and making sure that there's something valuable for them.
Yeah, because the two questions, they're about, I'd say about 15 degrees apart, and both are helpful for the audience. But I think the second one is probably where the audience is talking to us right now. And the point is, when we're in a conversation, we get too fixated on this back and forth between the speaker and the listener, and we change positions as well. So listening's like a simultaneous equation. There's a third presence in every dialogue, and what great listeners do is they notice this third position, and this is the position of the dialogue. Not what you're saying, it's not what I'm saying, it's the intersection of those two things coming together. And what great listeners do will notice, okay, how's that dialogue? Is it productive? Is it progressing? Is it stuck? Is it pathological? And there is nothing wrong with the way Mick's been listening. In fact, probably one of the best hosts I've worked with. So that's why I felt a little bit more comfortable to play a bit here. But we wanted to use it as an illustration to go, sometimes we get stuck in the dialogue and we forget external systems, particularly if you're in executive roles. You can either get stuck internally, you can get stuck externally, but you have to kind of play and dance with both positions. So when it comes to what the heck do I do with it, is that where you'd like to go next, Mick?
Yes, Oscar, that's a really interesting question. And I see where you're going with that in terms of thinking about where are we going? Like having some level of intentionality with the conversation, both as a listener and a speaker, and thinking about what is going to lead us towards something that's going to be fruitful. And in this case, fruitful for our audience in terms of what can they take away from today's discussion around putting this into practice, particularly if they do take the time to be self-aware around their own learning, their own listening skills and how they're going to build upon that. So I'm going to reframe the question a little bit because the audience are very familiar with some of the work that we've covered in previous episodes, including Otto Scharmer's work around deep listening. And where we were touching on was this thing that you brought up about being the willingness to have your mind changed, to have your mind shifted. And Otto talks about going beyond listening to what you already know and having the open mind, the open heart and the open will to be able to really shift your thinking based on what the other person's talking. So as a leader listening to the show, if I do want to demonstrate that to my people, if I do want to give them the gift of deeply listening to them and having that ability to shift my mind and listen beyond what I already know and deeply listen to them, how do I get started with that?
Well, the first thing I would say is move your listening to making sense for yourself. That's not your role as the listener. Your role as the listener in that executive context is to help the speaker say what they think and what they mean. This requires a lightness on your part as a listener. And I want to give you, there's an art to listening and there's a science to listening. Let me just give you some of the science. And this is the speaking speed and the thinking speed of the speaker. So the speaker can speak roughly between 125 to 175 words a minute, roughly. English-speaking Western workplaces. To think about it differently, a cattle yard auctioneer or horse race caller can speak at about 200 words per minute. You can understand everything they're saying. Yet, when the speaker is thinking, they're thinking at a speed which is vastly faster. They're thinking at speeds of 600, 700, 800, 900, 1,000 words per minute. Now, if you just pause on the math there and you go, wow, they speak at 125 words a minute, but they can think it up to 900. So if all you do is dialogue into the first 125 words or even the second 125 words they say, you are listening to 14% of what they think and mean. Good listeners notice what people say and great listeners notice what they don't say. When you're in a conversation with somebody who's dealing with something that's complex, dynamic, conflict, collaborative, constrained. These are all typical scenarios in organizational contexts. The likelihood they can say exactly what they think and what they mean the very first time is pretty low. So the neuroscience is against us before we even get into distraction, before we even get into misunderstanding, before we even get into judgment, before we even get into assumption overlays, before we get into cognitive bias, which are all another set of layers. So know that if you're just having a conversation with somebody with the very first thing they say, that's why you're going to do rework. That's why there's probably going to be tension in the dialogue. If we just wait a little longer and let them get the next 125 words out, we're probably going to hear something enormously different in the next 125 and the next 125. But it's not for us to hear, it's for them to say. Let them get out what they think and what they mean, not just what they type into their email inbox the very first time, because even an email, you will edit it before you send it. But when we speak, we do some level of editing, but it's as much for the other person what they're hearing. So moving your listening posture from my job is to understand clearly what they say so I can provide an answer, a perspective, whatever it is, to my job here is simply to be here and let them get to the point that matters to them. Trust goes up in selling situation, rapport goes up, referral goes up, because listening is a pretty differentiated skill if you're in sales, for example, or you're trying to communicate long-term change. People will listen to you very differently if you've taken the time to hear what they fear the most in the change as well. But we can't hear that if all we do is start to have a conversation with the very first thing they say.
Yeah, really powerful stuff, Oscar. And it comes down to what you were talking about with the tribes, Polynesian tribes, etc., holding space, learning to be the last to speak and really let someone go through their cognitive process. So I'm really taking that as a key takeaway. Thinking at 900 words a minute, only expressing 125 of those words per minute at a time. And unless we hold space and let someone to get through that cognitive process, we didn't get to that golden moment that I was talking about before, where the penny will drop of, that's what they're thinking. That's what they're feeling. That's what they're concerned about. And if we hold space, we'll let them get there. If we interrupt, we'll never get there.
And they feel in that moment, they feel seen, they feel heard, they feel valued. When you listen in this way, they feel seen, they feel heard, and they feel valued. Can I just give everyone a commercial break from interrupting? All interruption is not bad. If somebody's story is going in a huge circle and they're repeating the same thing over and over and over again, there is a skillful, elegant, subtle, professional way to interrupt. Never interrupt somebody mid-sentence. Interrupt them on an out-breath when they've completed a sentence. But when they do, just ask them to summarize that into a subject line in an email. Get them to summarize it into one breath. Get them to summarize it into one story. And that interruption will be a helpful interruption. Listening in the workplace is not therapy. Please don't confuse yourself with those Netflix movie scenes where somebody's lying down on a couch. This is not the type of listening I've researched and we have evidence about. The type of listening we're talking about is workplace listening. And no matter whether your workplace is for profit or a public sector or a for-purpose organization, you still have an outcome to deliver. And repetitive pathologies may require different kinds of interventions eventually. But in the short term, please don't think that all interruptions are poor communication. Because again, if you just adjust yourself and go, my job is to help them say what they mean, sometimes what you're helping them to say is how to summarize it, because they're just, oh my God, somebody's listening to me for the first time. Let me just get it all out and let me go back and let me tell you all about it. And yet Mick will ask me, so Oscar, if I was to summarize that for the finance team, how would we summarize it? And they go, oh, okay, well, you'd say it like this. And they go, oh, yeah, that's how I would say it. And all of a sudden they've been seen, heard, and valued.
Yeah, that's really nice, Oscar. And you know who you've got me thinking of is Michael Bungay-Stanier. And I noticed that he wrote part of the foreword in your book or at the start of your book. And one of his things, when he is someone that has that, I'm going to call it verbal diarrhea for a moment, but it's that holding space and letting people get everything out, he'll just say, if he's confused, he'll just say, so what would you say is the real challenge for you? To be able to bring sharpness to what's the point here? What's the substance? What other tips could you give to people when they do have that situation where they're getting loads of content, but you want them to sift through and find the substance and the meaning?
When we think about what's being said, if you create a container for them, they'll say it differently. So I want to distinguish how a conversation takes place from what's discussed in a conversation. I want to talk about the difference between the process and the dialogue. Not enough of us spend time, just a minute amount of time, around the process of setting up a dialogue to be productive. With our deep listening ambassador community, we've been tracking 1,410 people over 5 years. And we've asked them, hey, try this tip, tell us what happens, what's the outcome. There's a handful of tips that consistently come back to us and people go, oh, yes, Oscar, that one. So this is the process tip that everybody talks about consistently. When you ask this question, meetings are definitely shorter. When you ask this question, you're role modeling listening. When you ask this question, it helps both the speaker, the listener, and the dialogue. Remember, I talked about that third position, progress. You can ask this question before the meeting happens. You might send somebody a text or a WhatsApp or an email, or you might give them a call before. In most contexts, whether it's a group meeting or a one-on-one meeting, just ask this question right at the very, very beginning. And Mick's going to laugh because I asked him this question at the beginning. What will make this a great conversation? Now, I want to introduce you to the concept of the listening compass. The listening compass helps us when we're lost in the dialogue, when the content's all over the place and we don't know where to go. The listening compass helps us to go, which direction should we be heading in now? Where is north? Where is south? Where is east? Where is west? The reason we ask this question is twofold. One is to keep the process of the dialogue going. So I'm going to envisage a 1 hour meeting. Most people in the workplace will be familiar with it. Just quickly, don't do 1 hour meetings. Make them 50-minute meetings and you'll already get 10 minutes back and it'll still be as effective. But 1 hour works for everybody because they know what 15-minute increments look like. So at the beginning of the meeting, I say, Mick, what will make this a great conversation? Now, I'm very specific that I don't say, Mick, what will make this a great conversation for you? Because Mick will tell me what will make a great conversation for you. We want the compass to hold the direction of the dialogue. What will make this a great conversation? Now, in 28% of cases, Mick will come back to me and say, so Oscar, what will make it a good conversation for you? Now, if Mick doesn't, you say, what would make it a great conversation for me is this, and we use that as a way. Now, at the 15-minute mark, what you say to Mick, roughly around the 15-minute mark where there's a natural break in the conversation, you say, Mick, at the beginning of the conversation, you said this would make it a good conversation. How are we going? Now, it's a pause moment. It's a calibration moment. It's a chance for an improvement. You're going to ask this question every 15 minutes. The first thing you show at the 15-minute mark is because you heard and remembered what Mick said at the beginning of the meeting, Mick goes, wow, he really listens. My trust has just increased because he played back what we said at the beginning of the meeting. Now, from the 15-minute to the 30-minute mark, Mick's going to be watching to see what do I adjust based on what he says. Now, in roughly 28% of the cases, Mick, when you ask that question, the speaker says something like, hey, I got everything I need, actually. We can cut the meeting short now. Or they'll say, I've covered off everything I want to, but while you've been discussing this, I've just thought of another thing that's related. Can we spend the next 15 minutes talking about that? So no matter what content we're in, which was your original question, how do I corral somebody who's just talk? If you don't have a listening compass, you won't get there. You have no structure in which to operate. Now, questions have energy and direction, so it's important that people understand this on the listening compass. North-south questions keep the conversation going in the same direction. If your intention is to keep the conversation going in the same direction, I'm going to give you one kind of question to ask. It's pretty short. And yet, if you feel that conversation is going to benefit by going in a different direction, you ask an east-west question. And these questions are pretty simple. Please personalize them. I'm going to give you the kind of ingredients and a little bit of the recipe. Don't say them robotically like I'm going to say them. And the first question is, if we're going north-south, we want to go in the same direction, tell me more or say more about that. Now, if Mick and I were in a conversation, I'd say, oh, wow, Mick, that sounds fascinating. Could you say a little bit more? So that's the intention of the question, to keep the dialogue going in the same direction. Yet at the 15-minute mark, I might think the conversation may benefit from us exploring different perspectives. Is there anything else? And what else? I'm curious, are there any perspectives we haven't covered? Now, if you combine the question at the beginning and check in every 15 minutes with knowing the intention of your question, you'll be able to progress the dialogue, not just whatever the speaker's saying, not just whatever you're listening to. So I'm curious, Mick, what's helpful in that for you rather than the audience?
It's definitely powerful for me, and I pride myself on practicing some of the things that I learned when I'm doing the podcast, by the way. So I'm going to be applying this listening compass starting tomorrow. What I like about it is I think we've all been in conversations that feel like it's drifting nowhere. And at the end of the conversation, we're still not sure. We've had a meeting, but we're still not sure what we covered and whether we met the objective. So I like the little course corrections, north and south, around, hey, have we covered what we were going to here? And you mentioned that sometimes the meeting might even finish where everyone goes, actually, yeah, we're done. And you don't have that drifting and that wasted 40 minutes that didn't add any value. But then with the tell me more or the and what else type questions, you're also expanding people's minds. You're expanding people's thinkings to go, okay, all right, we think we've covered it, but are we sure? Did we miss something? But we're still on point. So yeah, I'm loving this.
So let me give you a couple of practical examples. A lot of people don't realize that when it comes to our listening, we listen for similarity or difference as our primary orientation. Most people, based on Harvard's implicit bias association test, over 20 million people have taken this. 92% of people have a bias to listen for similarity, to validate their experience, their familial background, their education, their life journey, whatever that is. Now, what I'm about to point out is beware of prophets who give you false binaries, listening for difference, listening for similarity. The answer is you need to be listening for both, yet most people don't know when to listen for one or the other. When we are listening for difference and working with the clients, I do when I'm trying to expand their way of thinking about it, I'll go, you know what, Mick, we've spent the last 15 minutes of this workshop discussing this issue in great depth, but I speculate if your competition was in the room right now, they would be belly laughing because we haven't discussed something. What do you think that is? And that's a east-west question. Or, hey, Mick, you operate in a fairly heavily regulated industry. If the regulator was in the room right now, what would they be tearing their hair out about? And these questions will tend to stop the room or the person. Or you may say, if the media was listening to the kind of conversation we'd be having right now, what headlines would they be writing? Now, that's actually a north-south question because that's getting into similarity. But all of a sudden, you've changed perspective. And in a lot of organizational contexts, the easiest way to change perspective, to move people out of listening for similarity to difference, is to move them to an external position of thinking of this discussion. The competition overseas, a different industry, 10 years in the past, 10 years in the future. Yet too many workplace conversations get obsessed with the internal conversation, which is all similarity. So there's two ways of attending your attention, similar or different. Now, typically, this is a really basic prescription, but everyone will kind of get why. At the beginning of a relationship, at the beginning of a project, that's a really good time to listen for similarity. It's the things that are going to join us together and give us common purpose. Towards the end of the first third and towards the beginning of the second third of a project, a product, a sales cycle, and a building of engineering of an assembly plant, you definitely want to be conscious of where groupthink is overtaking and everybody's thinking similarly. That's where you want to bring in externalities or bring in difference in there as well. All questions don't have the same value. And when you understand right now, does this conversation, back to that question on our compass, what will make this a good conversation, which question is going to serve us getting to the destination that we'd agreed on at the beginning?
I really love this, Oscar, and I want to play back to you what I'm taking away from it. And that is related to first, second and third position thinking, right? And I'm going to say that a lot of us go into conversations and we start with first position. We start with what are we thinking? What are we feeling? What are we doing? What are we being? As we develop ourselves as leaders, we start practicing empathy with those that we're talking with, and we develop second position thinking. I start thinking, what is Oscar doing? What is Oscar thinking? What is Oscar feeling? That the questions that you're asking, and my curiosity would be curious about you, Oscar. To be, when you say topic X, what do you mean by topic X? And I want to know what you think. The questions that you're asking, which is quite new to me, is now third position empathy. What what are they thinking? If someone was watching this conversation from the balcony, what are they seeing? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? And inside a company, that's what we do. I'm going to swear here for a second on my own show, but we tend to start believing our own BS, and we're not thinking about what our external stakeholders would think about the situation that we're talking about. So yeah, first position, you're only thinking about yourself. Second position, you are empathizing with the person you're talking about. Third position, this externality that you're bringing to the table, Oscar, is really expanding my mind. That's something that I'm certainly going to take away from this. And the examples that you gave of both east, west and north, south questions that would do that, what would the regulator think? What would the media think if they saw this? What would our competition be reacting if they were a fly on the wall right now? It's really powerful stuff.
And there's a range of them. It's like, what would the shareholders think? What would politicians think? What would our children think? What would our grandchildren think? What would this mean for the environment? What would this mean for urban living? What could this mean for a whole range of dynamic systems that we're typically not conscious of because we are here. We're here in that dialogue because we've got all the browser tabs open. We're not ready for the conversation. We want to get our position across. It's all in the I. This is it. Now, just finally on that question, what will make this a good conversation? That is not the agenda of the meeting. That is a question about how we dialogue. That is not a question about what is the outcome of the meeting. It is a question about how we dialogue. And for me, when I think about this, I think about Christopher and I think about his mum, Jennifer. And Christopher came home from junior school. He was in the US. Junior schools are roughly around 6, 7, 8 years old. And he came home to his mum and he said, "Hey, mummy, today I learned maths. Today I learned the 3 is half of 8. Now, Jennifer kind of was in the kitchen, wasn't fully present, and said, "Honey, could you say that again?" She said, Christopher says to her, "We learned maths and I learned the 3 is half of 8. She thought, what are they teaching kids at school today? Anyway, she went to the cupboard and she got a packet of chocolate M&Ms and she put 4 chocolate M&Ms in one row facing one way on the kitchen bench and 4 M&Ms facing each other one way on the bench. So you've got 4 M&Ms all facing each other. And she asked Christopher, "Honey, count how many M&Ms are over here?" And he said, 4, mummy. "And how many over there?" And he said, 4, mummy. And she said, "You see, 4 is half of 8, not 3. And Christopher then went to the corner cupboard and he got a Sharpie, or what they call a texter in the US. And on a piece of paper, he drew the figure 8 for his mum and he folded the piece of paper in half vertically. And he then tore it in half for his mum and showed her 2 perfectly formed 3s. In that moment, Jennifer realized that Christopher's thinking in geometry and she's thinking in arithmetic. And now Christopher could have turned the piece of paper horizontally and folded the piece of paper in half horizontally and showed his mum that 0 is half of 8 as well. Now, for many of us, we go into conversations in dynamic, complex, creative, collaborative, constrained, conflict situations where somebody says 3 is half of 8 and we go, "Oh my goodness, how many times do I have to tell them the 3 is not half of 8? They're wrong. I'm right. 3 is not half of 8. And yet you're listening to what they say and you're not noticing what they think and what they mean. And if you take the time to fully understand it's not your job to make sense of what they say. It's your job to get them to express what they think and what they mean. And they'll be seen, they'll be heard, and they'll be valued. That will give you discretionary effort in times where other leaders won't be able to access it because you have taken the time to explore that a little bit further. Today, Christopher is a world champion bug catcher and he's graduated from college. And for some of you, when I said world champion bug catcher, you may be visualizing somebody with a butterfly net in a park catching butterflies. And you'd be listening for similarity. And yet if you're listening for difference, you might have thought Christopher's a world champion software bug catcher. And Christopher would say to us right now, to improve communication and listening, just spend a little bit more time talking about how to have the conversation before you get into discussing what's in the conversation. And that's set up with that simple question, what will make this a good conversation? And then keep that listening compass going in the conversation if you're the leader in the conversation.
I love the story. It's really good. I'd love to meet Christopher one day and find out whether he's a software debugger or whether he actually catches bugs.
He's a software debugger.
There we go. But a wonderful example, though, because I will say I'm sitting here listening to you, and when you said that, that was what I instantly thought until you said, "Oh, is he wandering around a park with a catch?" Oh, and oh, maybe he is, right? So we all have our biases. We all jump to conclusions. And what I'm hearing from you is, I love the part about what will make this a good conversation, but then I'm also hearing the cognitive empathy and the curiosity, and not correcting someone and saying, don't be silly, 3 is not half of 8, but saying, well, how did you, that's interesting. Tell me more about how you get 3 is half of 8. And then you're often on a completely different tangent of a conversation, and a richer conversation, because you're able to see and think what the other person is seeing and thinking. Really powerful, Oscar. I want to come back to some practical things to give our audience. This has been a really rich conversation already, and I'm sure it's expanding a lot of people's minds. I want to talk about the things that hold people back. So you speak about the 4 villains, and we spoke about the interrupter before. Tell me more about the 4 villains that limit someone's ability to deeply listen.
The 4 villains came about, again, by listening. So the 4 villains, Oscar would turn up to a workshop, do his magic tricks and his song and dance. And one of my clients, who was the chair of the board, took me aside and said, hey, Oscar, that was amazing. But now everyone has to go out into their day job and you're not going to be there. Help us. And I said, okay, what will be useful for you? Well, can you have some kind of questionnaire that we could go through to answer some questions that would give us some insight? And then could you give us a report that gave us, some practical tips about what to do based on what we answered on those questions? I thought, okay. Now, it took 18 months from the time that question was answered to the time we delivered the listening quiz. And I'm so glad we did. I'm so glad that the difference between hearing and listening is taking that action. And the labels for what gets in the way of people's listening came back by asking one question 2 different ways. The first question we asked in our research that we did to get here was, what gets in the way of your listening? What do you struggle with when it comes to listening? So we asked that from the listener's perspective. And then we asked them a slightly different question. When you're the speaker, what frustrates you about somebody not listening to you? Now, what was really interesting for me as I started looking at all the research coming back, there was a ratio of 6-to-1 in how people describe what gets in the way of their listening, 1. And when we asked them to describe what really frustrates them about other people not listening, 6 times as many responses from the same person. Now, sometimes that number was 3-to-1 and sometimes that number was 10-to-1. Our average was 6-to-1. So for most of us, we don't even know what gets in our own way. We know in our research data that 74.9% of people, when we said compared to others in your workplace, how would you rate your listening? 74.6% of people said, I'm either above average or well above average when it comes to listening. Yet when we asked that question from the speaker's perspective, 12% of people said that the person who listened to them was well above or above average when it came to their listening. Now, what was really interesting is what were people saying that really frustrates them and what gets in their way. We boiled it down to 3 things, and we take a slightly different take on each of these. The 4 villains of listening came from the research, and it came from the labels that the speakers gave the listeners. So dramatic, interrupting, lost and shrewd. Dramatic, they keep moving the spotlight off the speaker and back onto themselves. They try to create emotional connection through a story or some kind of shared background, but what the speaker feels is it's all about them. The interrupting listener is very productivity and time orientated, but they're the quiz show contestant that presses the buzzer before the host has asked the question and they just give the wrong answer. And that creates a lot of friction in the relationship, drives down trust, really eliminates any kind of rapport you may have built up. People are lost in either their own thoughts or they're lost in some kind of external distractions like WhatsApp messages, Teams messages, Slack messages, anything that beeps and buzzes at them. And then finally, the shrewd listening villain, disproportionately represented in sales professions, any kind of helping professions, human resources, people and culture, IT, legal, accounting, medical, market research, any kind of consulting. The speaker always says, I know they think they're listening, but I know they're trying to fix me. So these 4 villains have come about through the extensive research we did. And, we've got over 26,000 people have gone and visited listeningquiz.com and got their own profile out of that, and 3 specific tips to help them. We tell them what their primary barrier is, and we also tell them what their secondary one is. So let me give you 3 underpinning tips that are easy to say, Mick, and yet they're hard to practice. Tip number 1, use the technology. Don't let the technology use you. Manage your notifications. For some of us, we work in industries where we can't eliminate them. We may be on call, we may be in a medical, we may be in an emergency service, and we can't turn them off. But for the majority of leaders, we allow the technology to make us a slave, and we respond to the technology. There is one button in every operating system, Mac, PC, Android, iOS. You can move it and it says switch off all the notifications. And if you want to get cute, there's one that switch off all notifications when I'm in a meeting. Now, there are times like me where I need to have my phone on because my dad's dealing with some medical situations that require me to be available. And on those days, when I'm working with people, I will say to them, Mick, I just want to let you know my phone is on. The only reason it will ring is because my dad's going to call me. He's had a stroke, and as a result of that, there are some medical conditions, and I know he's seeing someone today, and if the phone rings, it will be because of that. Now, because I've told you that in advance, you know it's okay for my phone to ring. Now, a lot of people think that it's the phone, it's the laptop, it's the tablet. There is a sneaky criminal at the end of everybody's wrist called the connected watch that is creeping up ever so slowly. And in our research and in our tracking, people have said consistently that this frustrates them more than anything else because they know that people are having this sneaky look and they know exactly what they're doing, and it's not checking the time. So use the technology, manage the notifications, even when it comes to your connected device. So tip number 2, drink a glass of water before every conversation. Drink a glass of water during each hour of the conversation. Remember, these are easy to say, yet difficult to practice. So for me, Mick's noticed this. I've had a glass of water by my side and I keep refilling it. It's same for Mick. It sends a signal here to this part of the body saying everything's okay. This is called the parasympathetic nervous system. This is the part of the body that protects the heart and the lungs, and the first part of the body that reacts when it feels threatened, when it feels like it needs to justify, when it needs to be doing any kind of defending. So just drink a glass of water. When you notice you're drifting in a conversation, when you notice you're getting distracted, when you're struggling to stay in the conversation, just take a moment. Now, if you're the host of a group meeting, always have water present in the meeting. And that doesn't mean in a jug with unfilled glasses. It means fill the glasses up in a meeting room and make sure everybody's got them within arm's reach. Tip number 1, manage the technology. Don't let it be taking you into a slave. Tip number 2, drink the water. 1 glass before you go into the conversation, 1 glass every hour of the conversation. And then tip number 3 is even simpler to say, harder to do. 3 deep breaths. We're going to the same part of the body, the parasympathetic nervous system, getting the O2, the oxygen, down into the lungs, going through the nose, not through the mouth, through the nose, all the way to the bottom of the lungs, out through the mouth. When you get distracted, have a glass of water. And if you're still distracted, take a deep breath. Now, 4 bonus points. If you've mastered all 3 of those, play a song before you go into any meeting of a group setting or something at significant risk for you. Play a song that is going to help recharge your listening batteries, rewire your mindset to move into the conversation. So if the conversation you're going to go into requires depth and thorough thinking, maybe a slower beats per minute song. If you're going into an energetic meeting where there's a lot of people in the group, maybe it's a little bit quicker. And if you really need to be the energy in the room, you may be playing a song at up to 150 to 175 beats per minute. Pick your favorite song. If you read the book, you'll see what my favorite songs are in there, and 3 completely different kinds of songs that I use to know and get my energy and presence and my listening batteries ready. Now, we talked about the listening compass. The listening batteries is how charged are your listening batteries when you go into a conversation, because sometimes we have to say, Mick, now's not a good time. Can we come back to this topic in about 45 minutes? Because right now I'm not ready to listen to what you have to say. I'm not ignoring you. I'm just not ready. And we have some fun. We run a poll in big groups and we say, what color is your listening battery coming into this conversation? We get a range of colors. Yet funnily enough, we ask them that same question at the end of a presentation, and 25% of the group has moved closer closer towards green than what they started at the beginning of the conversation because they're conscious now, whether it's notifications, breathing, water, how do they recharge their listening batteries?
Really good, Oscar. There's lots of useful takeaways there. I'll share back some of the things I took away from that last section. The first one is about the self-reflection and self-awareness, and related to what you were saying about if you really think you're a good listener, think about what frustrates you as a speaker, and then take the time to self-reflect and go, do you exhibit any of those behaviors that you dislike as a speaker? Do you exhibit any of those behaviors when you're a listener? And going through the 4 villains and around all of those things and the interesting one around the shrewd listener, it doesn't matter whether you think you're a shrewd listener or not, it's whether the other person thinks you're a shrewd listener or not that impacts the way they feel about the conversation. Then those 3 takeaways around don't let the technology run you. You use the technology, use the water, manage your parasympathetic nervous system, the 3 deep breaths. And then the last one about the music, I tell you what my takeaway is, and something that I practice, and love your feedback on this, intentionality. When I'm going into a meeting, I set an intention of how do I need to show up and what will serve me best in terms of how I show up to that meeting? Is it a meeting where I do need to be upbeat and inspire and motivate people? Is it a meeting where I need to hold space and be curious? So for me, I love your tip about music, but for me, it's about setting an intention even before you step in the room. How does that sit with you?
And it's always the intention for the group, what will make this a good conversation. And for me, when I'm setting that intention, the energy I'm bringing is not my current energy or where I'd like my energy to be. It's what does the group outcome need for my energetic state to be? I find this hilarious. One of the reviews of the book says, listening is like sex and comedy. We all think we're better at it than we really are. And I took an enormous amount of time to reflect on this. In fact, my wife said way too long to reflect on this because I was chatting to her over the dinner table and I said, what I love about this review is comedy, the value of comedy, it's with the audience. No matter how good a comedian you think you are, the comedy is valued by the audience. She goes, I don't need to know what your comparison is when it comes to the other one, Oscar. And I think when you think about comedy and listening, one of the things a comedian will do is they will practice that line in a whole different bunch of ways. They'll rewrite it a number of times. They'll try it out on someone they trust, and then they bring it out a little bit wider, and then they bring it out a little bit wider. And then maybe they try it on a smaller group, and then they move it to the bigger group. And then they understand what's the audience passing back to me, and then I will use that in my routine. When you think about adjusting your listening, adjust it first with those who are close and know you, and you can make some adjustments and you can tell them it's an experiment. Don't go and try these ninja listening moves on a big group of people in a high-risk commercial negotiation. Please don't. It's probably not going to turn out too pretty. But like comedy, practice, iterate, make your little improvements, try it out on slightly bigger audiences each time, and then make it part of your routine.
Yeah, really good, Oscar. And that's something that I think should be the call to action for everyone here. Pick one thing that Oscar has mentioned today and then go and practice with your small group, people that you trust, people where you're on safe ground, and try one thing at a time. And I strongly encourage you to get a copy of Oscar's book. And for those watching on the video, I am holding it up, How to Listen. There's also wonderful materials that come with it, including a bunch of playing cards. And these are really interesting, where you can start getting into here around some different concepts. And on the back of the card is a tip and a question for you to think about, how would I approach that? So please do take advantage of Oscar's materials, but go one step at a time and practice in a small group, like he said, before you try and practice it in a more crucial situation.
So Mick, what's your one takeaway from today that you're going to practice?
The third position stuff, the stuff that you said about the dialogue. I practice, I believe, once I'm part of your statistics, by the way, I think I'm a better than average listener, just like everyone else. But what I practice deeply is listening to another person. Whereas what I've taken away from you today is that third position of what would someone watching the conversation be thinking right now. That was my biggest takeaway. There were many, by the way, but that was my biggest one. And I do feel richer for having this conversation, Oscar, without any doubt. I am going to bring us to a close now with our rapid round. This is the same 4 questions that we ask all of our guests, Oscar. And I'm really curious for your answers here for sure. What's the one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you were 20?
The advice my dad gave me, you can't always be the smartest in the room, but you can be the hardest working in the room. And that advice was great for when I was 20. It's very different now when I got grandkids.
All right, very good. What's your favourite book?
The Tower and the Square by Neil Ferguson. It's so Neil's a Scottish historian and he's an amazing researcher. And the book is about the pendulum swings over time between hierarchies and distributed networks in leadership throughout the century. And what are the preconditions that move a hierarchy into a network and a network into a hierarchy? And the overlay for that is everybody kind of goes, the current technology is unprecedented. And he goes through changes in technology over millennium that you go, oh, okay, well, it's just part of the pendulum swing, and really rich, well-researched examples in that.
Yeah, really interesting. I'm going to check that out for sure. What's your favourite quote?
Try not, do or do not. There is no try.
Oh, Yoda. Well done. I love it.
And if you look carefully behind me, you'll see lots of Yodas.
Oh, you do. I didn't notice. We've been on this conversation the whole time and I did not notice that at all. And finally, Oscar Trimboli, I know that people in this audience, their mind has been expanded by this conversation. They will want to know more. They'll want to give this a try. How do they get in contact with you if they would like to get a copy of the book, do the quiz, all of these resources that we've been talking about?
Yeah, look, getting in touch with me is interesting. What would be productive? My request for everybody is learn about your listening, visit listeningquiz.com, take the quiz, and then you'll get pointers to all the other things you've just talked about there, Mick. And it'll take you 7 minutes max on average. People complete the quiz in 4.5, and you'll get a report that will tell you what's getting in your way. But more importantly, we'll give you some practical tips to do something with it as well.
So, Oscar Trimboli, I'd like to thank you for your time today, for expanding our mind, expanding our listening skills, and getting us to stop, reflect, and rethink the way that we go about our listening in the workplace. It's been greatly appreciated.
Thanks for listening. Now, please don't switch anything off. I've got a question for you. You might put a bonus at the end. What did you notice about my listening?
Yeah, good question. I'm going to say, without using identically the questions that you spoke about with the listening compass, I'm going to say you were looking to guide the conversation through your listening, and there were times where you're almost asking meta questions about the conversation. Do you know what I mean? It's like,
what was an example of that?
So, ad break now. Where were you going with that question, Mick? And that wasn't the exact word you used, but what would your audience be looking for from that question? That's a meta question for me of, is this conversation working? Is it meeting the intention that you and I set before we pressed record? I've never had that before.
Are you going to leave it in?
Oh, yeah. I love it.
And imagine we were starting the interview now. What's one thing you wish I would have done differently to serve your audience?
Oh, another powerful question. I'm going to say there's probably some questions that I asked that got left hanging when we did those little deviations. So because I've got an insatiable curiosity, which I shouldn't assume that everyone has, but because I've got an insatiable curiosity, I felt like there were a few roads that we didn't finish before we tracked back and went up a different road. But that was both the beauty, like I'm being really open with you here, that was both the beauty and also the frustration of the conversation. Does that make sense? So because I wanted to, I'm a dot I's, cross T's person. I wanted to know your answer to those questions where you said, oh, hang on a second, Mick, why are you asking that question? And off we went on a slightly different branch. It's what I loved about the conversation, but it's also what I would have loved to have answered. That's almost bipolar, but that's my answer to that.
Love it. It just made the conversation human, right? It wasn't question, answer. It was kind of the roles have moved around a bit. Yeah. Okay, cool. Hey, let me know when you're live and I can share with my network. Yeah. And tonight's a joy for me because you would know this. There's two kinds of hosts. There's the hosts that turn up and there's the hosts that care about their audience. You're the second one. Your curiosity got more out of me than most interviews. So thanks for listening.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I'd like to now ask the same questions back to you. How was it for you?
I've listened to past episodes and I knew about your playback pattern. I was curious how the audience would react when that pattern wasn't
disrupted. Yeah, right. I just interrupted you, by the way. I was the interrupter.
No, I'd finished. And I think when you listen on the playback, I'd be curious to see how you notice how you responded there in that moment, because your energy was very different in your response to all the other questions you were asking me.
Yeah, right. So the full open and transparent, when you first asked me, I did feel challenged, right? My notifications just came back on because the time expired. I felt challenged when you first asked. But then afterward, I realized, oh no, this is good. This is a good challenge. This is not a challenge to my identity. This is not a challenge to my skill. This is not a challenge to me. This is a good challenge to enhance the conversation and make sure that people listening from a third position are going to get deep value out of this. So I loved it, but I did feel challenged when you first did it.
And when you hear the playback, even watch the playback, your body position shifted dramatically. And if my memory serves me correctly, your spinal position also moved dramatically as well. So you'll notice your vocal cadence changed. And what was the third thing? There was a third thing that changed in there as well. I can't remember, but there were three things that changed there. Didn't make any of it good or bad. For me, it's like I wanted to create a learning moment for the audience to go, how does a question change the way the speaker engages in that conversation? So, and feel free, please use all of this as well if you want to put that at the back end of the episode and say, hey, we had a debrief after.
Yeah. No, this is really cool. So now I want to ask you, so I do practice my listening. It's something that I'm very intentional with, but I'm a human being. I'm not perfect by any means. What would you say my listening kryptonite is? You could use your 4 villains, or how would I take my listening to the next level?
I think my response would be more useful if you put it in a context, because I can give you very different response for you as a podcast host than I can as you as the leader.
Yeah, okay. That's a good point. So when I'm listening in the workplace, I'm looking to stay curious and draw out of the person that I'm talking to, second position, not third position. That's a takeaway for me today. But in second position, really draw out what the person is thinking, feeling, doing, getting them to expand their mind at the same time as getting them to take deep ownership of the result. Because I could, as a COO, I could spend all day telling people what to do, and actually they'd probably do it, but they wouldn't take any ownership and accountability of the outcome. Whereas when I ask them questions and stay curious, what do you think needs to be done by the end of this week, and what makes that important, and what positive impact will come if we're able to do that, and what challenges do you think we'll encounter? I ask more questions than I give direction in my job, right? And I'm trying to draw out from the person, what are they thinking? What are they feeling? What are they going to do? And getting them to take ownership and accountability for what they then do next. As a podcast host, I'm looking to draw out lessons. I'm trying to think, Oscar said something really important there. That was my takeaway from that. And I try to repeat it so the audience see what I'm taking away from the conversation. They may take completely different things, but what I'm trying to do is draw out the lessons. So as a podcast host, I do listen differently compared to what I do in the workplace. That's interesting.
Therefore, do you want to ask me the original question?
Yeah. So how would I take my listening to the next level as a leader?
Okay. So one of the things we learn in the research, the 3 characteristics of great listeners is openness, curiosity, and flexibility. So think about openness, curiosity, and flexibility. Just give yourself a score 1 to 5 on each of those as you describe yourself in the workplace.
Yeah. Okay. Aspirationally, I'd like to be very open, but I know that I do go into conversations with a preconceived idea, and therefore I have to very deliberately remain in an open will state where I'm listening to what the other person say, because I also think very quickly. So it means that I jump to conclusions too quickly. So I'd say my openness would be a 3 at best. Curiosity, I'm going to say a 4 or a 5, because I do, when someone says something interesting, I go, oh, tell me more about that. What makes that important to you? So I'd say curiosity is probably a 4, and flexibility, it's probably back to a 3 again, because on a villain level, I could end up in a situation where people might perceive a little bit of shrewdness because I'm subtly trying to shift the conversation more than I should.
So think about openness and flexibility in your role and for your outcomes. Which one matters more?
Openness.
Okay. So thinking about one thing that could move openness from a 3 to a 4 to a 5 in the next really icky conversation that you're going to have tomorrow in the workplace, not next week, next month. What's one thing you can do?
Yeah, it would be to hold space longer and to have that open will to truly listen to what the other person's saying instead of like I've been in my industry.
Yeah. So time out. I want you to dial in to a conversation tomorrow you know is going to be icky. Don't tell me about it. I want you to dial into that.
Classic one. Got it. Yep. I know exactly what I need to do.
What is that thing you need to do in open tomorrow in that conversation? And it could be before the conversation to set it up. Could be after the conversation. Could be during the conversation. What is that one thing?
So before, it'll be the intentionality of holding space. During will be not interrupting, being comfortable with silence and letting the person build up to what's really troubling them. And after will be the ability to, after or is it at the end of the conversation to make them feel like I truly heard them?
Well, I just want to invite you to explore the possibility that you could do something to expand open before the meeting for them, not just for you.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. And I feel like I can set the scene at the start or even before the meeting. Yeah.
How would you set the scene before the meeting so that you're both more open?
There's a set of words I can use, but I need them to feel it, not just to hear the words. And that is that I'm here to give you a good damn listening to. And I'm truly interested in what you've got to say and how you're feeling. But that's words until I demonstrate it. It'll come across as rhetoric if I say those words and my actions are incongruent with that. So it won't be until in the moment that they see that I'm truly listening that they will go, oh, he was right. He does want to know what I've got on my mind.
And hopefully now you've seen how by not answering your question, you have answered your own question.
Yeah, very clever. Well done, Oscar. All right, sir. Really enjoyed this. We will be in contact when we're going to go live. I meant every word I said. I feel richer for having this conversation. I feel like I've just had a private coaching session for the last almost 2 hours. Yeah, really loved it, Oscar. Really good. Thank you so much.
And you honour my work. You've read my book and you've turned up with an intention to discover more. And I experience you as open and curious and flexible. So thanks for listening.
All right. Thank you, sir. You have a good evening. Talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to The Leadership Project at mickspears.com. A huge call out to Faris Sadek for his video editing of all of our video content and to all of the team at TLP. Joanne Goes On, Gerald Calabo and my amazing wife, Say Spears. I could not do this show without you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Leadership Project YouTube channel where we bring you interesting videos each and every week. And you can follow us on social, particularly on LinkedIn, Facebook and Instagram. Now, in the meantime, please do take care, look out for each other and join us on this journey as we learn together and lead together.